Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Liz, and thank you all for joining. Welcome to today's webinar on how to move shared equity housing forward with better data. I'm Julie Bosland, Executive Director of the Cooperative Development Foundation. And just as an introduction, CDF is committed to ensuring that all people can address challenges, pursue their aspirations, build shared wealth, and thrive in community. And we believe that cooperatives and other shared equity models are important pathways to achieving this vision. Over the past 3 years, CDF has been working to better understand the needs and opportunities for shared equity housing to promote permanent affordability, housing stability, and resident leadership. This work was made possible by the generous support of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the input of countless local practitioners across the country, collaboration from national partners, and the tireless efforts of CDF Senior Advisor Mary Griffin and the fantastic team at CDF and the National Cooperative Business Association. As part of our learning grant, we wanted to explore the relationship between shared equity housing and health and well-being outcomes, including racial equity. And today we have the pleasure of sharing 2 new resources that will help all of us as a field address this question. The first is the state of data in shared equity housing programs, and the second is titled Measuring Racial Equity in Shared Equity Housing. And we'll drop those resources. Those are showing up in your chat right now. And then we have an excellent lineup of speakers today to walk you through the key insights from these reports and how to use them. So Dylan Cohen of the Jonathan Rose Company will be our facilitator throughout, introducing and guiding the conversation. Brett Theodos of Urban Institute developed the first resource and will present on that. Vidette Gavin of Verge Impact Consulting is the author of the second resource and will share those insights. And Olivia Ildefonso of North Arrow will explore how you can effectively use data to support decision-making and more effectively make the case for shared equity housing. To give you a sense of our agenda for today, we'll have the opportunity to hear presentations from each of these speakers on the state of data and shared equity programs, the perspectives we heard in a virtual roundtable on the impact of shared equity housing on racial equity, and we'll dive into where to start and how to use this data in the work that you do. And of course, we'll reserve time for Q&A at the end. So let's dive in. Dylan, handing it off to you.
Great. Thank you, Julie. It's a pleasure to be here and to have been working with CDF on this initiative for a little over a year now, I think. A lot of friendly faces in the room, both familiar people to me, but I'd love to just get a sense before we get into what shared equity is. As a quick understanding in the chat, could you just indicate if you're a researcher or a policymaker or maybe a practitioner of shared equity or maybe just interested public? That'd be really helpful just so that we have a sense of who's in the room and what kinds of questions might be the most relevant for us to speak to. So while that streams in, why shared equity housing? These are things that all of you will know pretty well, but we really are interested in it in terms of the Cooperative Development Foundation and AHI because of its ability to permanently decommodify housing and still promote home ownership and all of the benefits associated with that permanence. So we're excited about the prospect and the possibility of shared equity models to realize material changes in community and in residents themselves. And we also know that many of these promises are lofty, they're ideological, they're values-based, and they're not necessarily things that have very clear measurable items to speak to. So our work in this is really to better understand when we get to more specific questions other than why is it good, what the data can tell us or what the actual implications are in racial equity components for shared equity models. So in our context, we're of course interested in permanent affordability and home ownership. And it's part of this larger housing question that we're all asking about what kind of model is most appropriate to respond to the moment and to implement solutions that communities own and are proud of. We can go to the next slide. So, Affordable Housing Initiative, as a project of a number of partners, is interested in this data question and educating both policymakers and communities about the models. So, we want to proliferate the models, and we also want to help people understand what the implications are of them, both from a values-based idea and also the more quantitative and measurable side as well. So, it might look like specific policy techniques or mechanisms that we're proliferating, but also data and reports. And there have been a number of exciting initiatives coming from this, a number of bodies of research coming from this initiative. And I encourage everybody to look at the AHI website and understand the programs that have resulted from this work. Next slide. So the question today, and part of AHI just overall, is how does and can shared equity housing advance things like housing stability or racial equity? And how can it improve the financial and other capital measures at the household level or the performance of lenders, et cetera? And then what is the impact on residents, on civic participation and well-being? And does their health improve? These are all things that we can hypothesize and can start to theorize, but can we prove any of these? And we now know, because of the millions of people living in these kinds of models across the world, that there is some data that exists, but it's our job to really take stock of that. So that brings us to the next slide, which is really about like what we want to know in order to answer these questions. And our work that I'll present along with Brett Theodis in a minute is understanding this current state of data, and then thinking about what the consequences are around a shared data platform or using a shared tool to communicate the data that exists. And then to ask also questions about resident data collection and the implications there, and really identify for the field, as a field building initiative, where to start. Okay, so let's move into the first body of research. And nice to see so many practitioners, et cetera, in the chat. So this is a new report that the Urban Institute and myself worked on. It's an exciting opportunity to take stock of the data that's available. And if we go to the next slide, I'll describe the research questions. So fundamentally, we're interested in understanding how well are these shared equity housing programs collecting data, both on residents and their outcomes, but also the projects themselves, and what gaps exist. And if there are gaps, or if there's good infrastructure already, what opportunities exist now to do case making and bring more people on board to the shared equity mission. So this work involved us interviewing stakeholders across the shared equity housing continuum. We talked with folks in the CLT and municipal inclusionary zoning program space. Those were practitioners, lenders, policymakers, et cetera, a number of TA providers. And then we also did an extensive review of publicly available literature. So we were really interested in these three models as a first stab understanding of what data might exist now. Where's the highest likelihood of high quality data? And the goal really wasn't just to identify gaps, because, as a preview, there are many gaps in the data. We also wanted to identify what's feasible and where some investment in infrastructure or in data collection might have the most leverage. But because shared equity is decentralized by nature inherently, it's a strength for local responsiveness, right? But it's a real weakness when it comes to building that evidence base. So we'll get into that a little bit. I'll pass to Brett.
Great. Good to be with you all, and good to see so many people who have come up to join the discussion. We are hoping that this will be a discussion, so we're going to throw some content at you, but hope that your questions are getting queued up. So here's our headline. Here's our big takeaway, our conclusion, and our provocation to all of you, is that we feel that the shared equity sector is missing. And when we say sector, we really mean global, is missing some vital case-making resource and tool and ability through some data weaknesses. And that we observe that there is a real lack of data infrastructure at this juncture to prove impact, to attract new funders, or even to facilitate the kind of learning that works well in organizations. So we'll get into the details in just a minute, but we're talking about things like lacking standardized data access across programs, about models, longitudinal data. We're talking about outcome data, and we'll get into some of the specifics for the different types of shared equity models as we go.
Great. Well, I've said this a little bit, but I really want to hammer it in that we have some pretty strong values-based arguments about why this kind of model and these models overall are important, and a solution around the pressures of the housing market. Um, but we need more than stories. And without the better quantitative, high fidelity data, we are left with only these values-based arguments. So the people in the room, like at a webinar like this, are already probably believers. They're not the skeptics. And the challenge for us is the next funder or the next city council member or the next lender who is actually in a position to advance a product that might allow more access to these programs or new creation, new construction and acquisition. And they need to understand out of all of their tools why this one is particularly important. So we really want to be able to answer the very basic question, does this actually work? Does it accomplish all of its promises? And how do we know? So go to the next slide. I'll talk about four kind of central problems here in the shared equity data landscape. The first is decentralized data collection. And we've also got inconsistent standards, of course, limited sharing, and then the systemic challenges that underpin a lot of this, namely in funding. We know that the programs aren't doing a bad job necessarily themselves of collecting data. Many of them do everything they can to collect data, and the issue is actually at, the resident level because people are nervous about sharing information or it's time consuming and it's hard to continue to share information with a number of new survey providers or whomever is coming in. Many of these providers, these housing providers, also very much care about the data case making work, whether it's evaluation for their own funders or to understand their impact. So folks are doing a really good job where they can, but of course the issue is the consistency in the floor. We know that resident information sharing is a really key problem because the provider promises to use data in ideally really thoughtful ways. But then the issue with having a strong data set that describes the outcomes of people in shared equity and maybe the racial components or the like specific makeup, perhaps the immigration status of your household, that presents some real information risk. And we're basically requiring fragmented, small housing providers to have a bunch of data governance structures as well. And that can be time consuming and expensive. So it's complicated and not that easy for us to just impose a new question for all these folks. And the systemic challenge here really opens up to a set of questions about the recommendations. And we'll get into that obviously later, but what can happen at a more institutional level or a funder level to address some of these gaps because they were vast. Pass it to Brett to get into some of the data tables for this work.
Great, thanks. So what we're seeing here, did we lose our slide?
First one, CLTs.
Okay, great. What we're seeing here is the kind of dynamic where we want to be able to really help the sector and the field to advance. And so we actually see some strengths here, given the infrastructure that has been built out. So we can see that in terms of certainly collecting transaction level information and knowing that CLTs have an infrastructure, grounded solutions, Homekeeper that has been built out. It does a good job of capturing basic property information, of getting household roster, some household demographics, often income, metrics around financial stability, less so. Mortgage delinquency actually does quite well. Sales prices, of course, as well. Reasons for selling, some of these things are offered as collections, but not always completed. Satisfaction with programs, and certainly where buyers are going next, as well as really measures of things like health, civic involvement, and then longer term outcomes being real gaps. But worth acknowledging that not all CLTs use that system and format, and the reporting gets much less consistent from there. So important to keep in mind the full universe of land trusts that are out there. Great. I lost the view of our slides. Are you seeing it, Dylan, on your end? You
It's
are,
the
Julie?
inclusionary zoning slide.
Okay, thanks. I'm not clear why I lost it on mine. So I'll go to IZ next. Great. So in terms of IZ, there is even more that we are seeing in terms of a diversity of options, because there's so many more operators and less standardization. But worth acknowledging the ability to also use Homekeeper for these type of models. But we looked at a number of cities in counties, Montgomery County and Fairfax and San Francisco and Boulder and Boston. And some similar stories are emerging in terms of some basic property information, in terms of household rosters and incomes and measured of financial stability, certainly mortgage delinquency, sales prices. And again, some of those dimensions around where places are going and how the residents are doing is much more difficult. I think it's okay to say on a recorded Zoom, I was asked some years back to go be the IZ director of an unnamed city's program. And the very first task that I was told would be my job if I took that job was to find where the IZ units were. They didn't know. These had been a developer mandate and had been instructed to put them into place, and nobody was tracking if they really were still there or really were in compliance in any sense, and even which properties they were in or which units in which properties they were in. And so that just hopefully helps illustrate the real diversity and breadth of data collection intentionality with respect to programs that are out there.
And this last data table's on limited equity co-ops. And I'll start by saying, out of all these models, there are the most co-ops. There are tens of thousands of units, hundreds of thousands in history in the United States. And they demonstrate a real wealth of resident potential level information that can describe what happens when people have the guarantee, the security of their tenure. And with that comes some specific models, because New York, which has the highest concentration of these co-ops, also is very excellently supported by UHAB, a TA provider who's on this call. Thank you to the organization for putting their time into this report as well. But it's one specific kind of co-op model. And there's also co-ops that exist on land trusts, and there's co-ops that exist outside of both of these things. And how each one gets technical assistance or how each one is reporting data can vary highly. So looking at three data sets here, the HUD Section 213 program that is the primary financing mechanism for many of these co-ops does have some information, a lot on the transaction and property level, as Brett described. That's pretty well captured by all the data sets because it's something that funders and lenders really need to know about. It backs all of their underwriting once they've already committed the values-oriented approach to this kind of program. On the resident demographics and income, it starts to get much more varied. And it's really this longitudinal piece that is a gap across these models. But we know that, for example, at Rock USA, one of the more recent data sets, because it's reflecting the resident-owned community transition for mostly manufactured housing into CLTs on land trust or co-ops on CLTs, the capacity there is much higher to ask questions about who are we benefiting and what is this program resulting in. And because the programs are created in today's climate, there's more interest in that case making and that longitudinal data set question and more systems in place to capture it on an ongoing basis. But then really this like long-term outcome is what's missing. We don't know necessarily what the impact is through all these hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people who've lived in co-op units, what the result of that might be on their health or their economic mobility or their ability to buy a property afterwards, and what it means to participate civically. Like, how does this fall into the renter versus homeowner continuum of civic engagement? So the bottom line here is really that the data is describing these buildings really well. We have good information about how many units there are, sometimes the quality of the buildings, et cetera, and that's aggregated and readily available. What we don't have is a systematic way across the various typologies of co-ops to identify resident outcomes.
Great. And so just double underscoring the inconsistency, and I think speaking for Dylan and I, we're really coming with a sympathetic frame here. This work is hard. It needs to be resourced. This is not some, researcher mandate just so we can understand the world better. We know that the very work of housing provision is hard. We know the work of housing production is hard. Even sustaining tenants in their place is difficult work. And so all of this is in support of and really in an effort to identify what level and type of resources are needed to accomplish the infrastructure building work that really is field wide. And that's part of what's hard about this process is any individual group might come to their own decisions about what's valuable from a data building perspective, but collectively there is significant value. And so what it might mean is that we're missing really important groups, and especially with respect to the co-ops, given the different organizing structure, we're really incomplete about that whole segment as well. So what do we recommend? What do we recommend? And that we hope collectively we can get energized to do something around. So first, standardizing some indicators, some core set of indicators, especially that are usable across models. That's where it gets harder, right? Harder than within a model. Well, of course, we want to preserve local adaptability for effective data collection, manipulation, analysis, and reporting. We know full well the sizable investment in data infrastructure that's needed. AI is not going to magically solve this problem and generate the insights from us. Could help with analysis, but we need to generate the data that can get it into place. And so we really need that shared platform, of course, one that really protects residents and their information in a very secure way. But getting that platform in place to allow, reducing of duplication and really strengthening the ecosystem builders in their work to do this. We need to be able to, have some investment probably from the shared equity programs themselves, but ideally as low a cost as possible to those groups, given their core mission of providing housing. So this is a great work for philanthropy to come alongside and see, really to seed investments into the sector. And while we're talking about meaningful investments, we're not talking about crazy investments. We are talking about consistent ones, though, because the work needs to be done to build and refine and standardize and operate over time. We do need capacity building and training to bring orgs up to the space, especially those that don't have full-time staff attached to them, right, in a co-op type environment or others, so that they can begin to get this information in a way that works. And of course, we want to be resident-centered in how the data are coming together. So there needs to be a measure of transparency, of sharing information back, of putting safeguards in place, and really centering priorities around what is known and shared and done, all while trying to keep in mind that this is in an effort and in an endeavor to build greater not just awareness, but commitment to the sector from the public sector especially, and philanthropic sector as well.
Great. Well, in the interest of time, I will very quickly summarize these questions. In general, we've presented some recommendations to the field, and they're detailed, the 6 of them in the report in high specificity, it's written. And we can also ask this group what they think about implementation, because what we know is it'd be great to have a deputized organization ready to start collecting data on behalf of the field, yet that has real implications politically and intergroup that we need to think through. Who is that organization, or what are the consequences of doing this in an organization themselves or a coalition, and what is the most sustainable fund model that a funder can get behind? And then truly, is more data collection as a requirement a valuable thing for us, because it does strain a lot of these providers. So rather than answering these questions right now, I'll move on to our next speaker. But it was nice to have the chance to share this work out loud. It was a many-month project. Now I'd love to welcome Vidette.
Thank you, Dylan and Brett. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk about the second report, which is about measuring racial equity and how shared equity housing models advance racial equity. Just some context for this report. In December 2025, CDF explored this question by convening a 2-day virtual roundtable that brought together researchers, housing practitioners, academics, community organizers, technical assistance providers, to understand how shared equity housing might advance racial equity, and what measures and data do we have now that could help to demonstrate that, and also where do we need to go for the measures that we don't have. And I'm going to share briefly today what we learned about that from that conversation. Next slide. I think as Brett and Dylan teed up really nicely, this is important because we do have demonstrated gaps in long-term resident outcome data, which is exactly the data that we need when we're talking about demonstrating the racial equity impacts of shared equity housing. So we have a lot of information about the property, the characteristics, how many units, what they cost, the financials, and things like that. But for resident outcomes, what happens to people over time, we don't have as much. And so in the midst of kind of that fractured information ecosystem and moving forward, forward with the recommendations that they presented, it's important to think about and be clear on how these models might contribute to racial equity, and what type of measurement approach and information points we might need to be able to demonstrate that. And I think a key thing from the day is that communities need the data to advance and secure investment for shared equity housing to make the case, right? And so there's a piece of having this data that really helps bring shared equity models to scale so that we can measure change over time. That's really important. I'll take the next few slides to share specifically what we learned, and you can also see this described in detail in the memo. All right. So before we could identify what to measure, it was really important, since we had a cross section of folks in the roundtable, to develop some shared language about what racial equity meant in the context of shared equity housing. And to do that, we asked folks to think about the outcomes that they are already working toward with respect to affordable housing, and what outcomes they would look to say affordable housing in general is contributing to racially equitable outcomes and opportunities. And so we landed on kind of 5 broad ways that affordable housing more broadly contributes to racial equity. And after this, I'll dive a bit deeper into what that looks like for measuring the shared equity housing contributions to racial equity. But in general, we talked about when we're talking about racial equity, we're talking about things like collective ownership, not just of land and property, but collective agency to shape community conditions as a form of ownership. Second, we're talking about wealth, very broadly defined. We're talking about financial capital, social capital, and community power and agency. It was really important in the conversation to challenge the tendency to equate racial equity solely with closing wealth gaps through property ownership, which is really relevant to this conversation about shared equity housing. Third, quality of life was a big one. This encompasses health, well-being, stability, belonging, and these are the outcomes that matter independent of wealth accumulation when we look at the advancement of racially equitable opportunities and outcomes through housing. Fourth, we're calling this redress and repair, but this is really about opportunities communities have through the housing options that they have. And one foundational element of this is education and awareness to enable access to housing options or models for different communities, with the understanding that access creates opportunity for historically marginalized and systematically excluded groups, for wealth building and collective ownership. And it also changes narratives about deservingness, right? And risk when thinking about and selecting and investing in housing models that are fit for certain communities. And lastly, self-determination and power within community context. And this was about, when we're thinking about how affordable housing advances racial equity, we're thinking about the ability of communities to define their own priorities, as Brett kind of mentioned, and to chart their path forward and to exercise that power in shaping systems, which really distinguishes the shared equity housing models from kind of paternalistic affordable housing models. So being on the same page about racial equity in the context of affordable housing, we thought about how we might measure those contributions. But first, we identified some key considerations to thinking about those measures. Next slide, and I'll talk about them. A few tensions emerged, and a few things that we wanted to be that they felt were critical considerations emerged when we think about measuring racial equity contributions of shared equity housing. The first one is thinking about whether we're measuring collective or individual ownership, right? We're several schools of thought in thinking about decoupling wealth from property entirely, and others pushing back to say, well, since housing has been the primary driver of wealth building, particularly for Black communities and communities facing displacement who need tangible assets, it's actually necessary to keep them together, right? And so this tension proved to be really important in thinking about the importance of shared equity housing in enabling communities to chart their own path rather than prescribing a single path. Another really important consideration, which I touched on in the broader definition, but was wealth and what we mean by and the importance of going beyond dollars and thinking about culturally congruent frameworks for wealth and underscoring the importance that shared resources create access to opportunity, and that is a form of wealth in and of itself. Thinking about time horizon was really important. When we think about racial equity, we're thinking about outcomes that might take 10 or 20 years, right? And normally the data we have for people, we're looking at things that might be visible within 1 to 2 years, like maybe anti-displacement programs, right? And so thinking that we need to measure both is important. And participation burden, both for cooperative governance that goes on in shared equity housing models, but also for data collection and the recognition that the burden for providing this experiential data or providing the data about resident outcomes disproportionately falls on the residents themselves with their time and folks with fewer resources. And then lastly, and this will be a foundational concept when we move forward and what to measure, but that there are awareness gaps and communities can't choose what they don't know exists. So when we're thinking about measuring the contributions of shared equity housing, we have to have some baseline understanding of communities' level of awareness of the models and access to the models to be able to then measure what is happening as a result of communities adopting and participating in them. Next slide. So I think here's our key takeaways when it comes to what to measure when we think about how shared equity housing models advance racial equity. And the primary bottom line that I think this roundtable presented was that shared equity housing models advance racial equity through community context and giving communities the opportunity, particularly marginalized and excluded groups to chart their own path on their own terms. That unlike other models of affordable housing, it's not about a prescriptive solution. Rather, it's a vehicle that enables communities to achieve multiple goals and advance multiple priorities at the same time. And the advancement of those priorities contribute to other racial equity outcomes in a broad array: economic, housing, health, well-being. This is critical with there's not a one size fits all kind of thinking about measurement here. So it would look different, the contributions in a gentrifying urban neighborhood than it would in a rural neighborhood, than it would in a sovereign indigenous community, and they'd be using those models to advance different goals. So I think this pie chart sums up the kind of five major categories that folks thought we have access that would be important to measure when we think about those racial equity contributions of shared equity housing. Anti-displacement instability, which is prevents forced mobility, but also gives people the intentional ability to grow in place with one another. Community control and agency, really about self-determination and decision-making. Collective wealth pathways, again, we talked about this earlier. Shared resources create the opportunities that are unavailable to individuals and allow those communities to chart their path forward. And then housing stability enables everything else. It's the foundation that will lead to upward mobility, well-being, educational attainment, job stability, all the other indicators that we typically look at in social economic contributions to racially equitable outcomes over time. Next slide. So now that we kind of got clear on what we are focused on when we're talking about racial equity in the context of shared equity housing, the question was, well, how do we gather this information? And I think something that kind of rose to the top was because we're talking about racial equity that is grounded in context for specific groups and their own priorities, that whatever approach we use to build the data infrastructure and collect the information must focus on the priorities of those groups and be useful to those groups themselves for building and sustaining and maintaining and scaling shared equity housing approaches for themselves. So some important things that we lifted up was all measurement approaches should ask who benefits versus who is harmed through the act of data collection itself and from the data being collected, making sure we're focusing on trends over time within racial groups. So rather than comparing over time only the comparison between Black and white or Asian and white, making sure to ask questions like, are Black families in this neighborhood more stable than they were 5 years ago? And measuring that to see that difference made, and being sure to include perceptions and lived experience as data. How do people perceive their neighborhood? How do they feel things are getting better? How is qualitative narrative information being used? But critically, what we heard is that folks should start with the information that we have. And there's a table in the report, if you want to take a look at it, of information, data points we have access to, and then data points we need to grow to be able to capture. And then something also that was important about the measurement framework is that there are different users for the measurement framework. So this also can't be when we talk about standardized measures that are useful to two groups. And I want to talk about that in a bit more detail on the next slide. Something that came through really clearly, we can go to the next slide, thank you. Something that came through really clearly was that when we think about who's using this data, communities are using it and cities are using it, and they're using it in two different use cases and looking for two different sets of things. And so when communities are asking for data to help make the case that shared equity housing advances racial equity, they're looking for data that will help them lift up to others in the community the difference made in their lived experience over time. They're looking for quality of life indicators. They're looking for testimonials about what it means to belong and have agency and have options and opportunity in those communities. They're looking at stability and economic mobility over time and social cohesion. Whereas planners, when they are trying to attract investment in and make the case for shared equity housing, they're looking for things about market context. They're looking to make the case about the permanence of affordability that Dylan and Brett lifted up in their report. They're looking for the cost and the ROI impacts on the budget and land access and so on. And so this is just really important when we think about what standardized measures we should invest in collecting, that we have two different users who are working in tandem to use this data to scale shared equity housing opportunities and outcomes in communities. I have two more slides that I'll go through very quickly. One, folks came up with, so what do we do? A set of priorities, and I want to emphasize the number one priority, and these were in order of priority by the group, was that we have to fund organizing and awareness. This is explicitly a top priority because, again, communities can't advocate for what they don't know exists. And that means education at every level. Community organizing, children should know about this in schools, planning departments, retraining underwriters and folks like that, but really raising the level of organizing and awareness about these models and their potential to advance racially equitable outcomes. The second was building that data infrastructure, which mirrors the report before, funding an intermediary data aggregator, a trusted neutral party to support getting data that communities can use to prioritize their goals rather than funder goals. Third, capital deal support, guarantee deals through MRIs, PRIs, funding equity gaps, and again, a nice place for philanthropy to come alongside. Number four, tools and training, narrative shifting, countering myths like CLTs, keeping people in poverty, training credit unions, CDFIs, underwriters who are defining return, risk, deservingness, things like that. And number five, echoing the previous report, a long-term consistent commitment rather than a short one. Next slide and final slide. I think the big takeaway, no single metric or standardized approach can capture the full contributions of shared equity housing to racial equity, and that's appropriate. But there are kind of key pathways to contribution that we kind of all agree on, and some ways that we can start gathering that information. Some data is better than none. and it's the small things that grow. So creating simple dashboards, documenting even small changes about the lived experience, the quality of life, can help to build momentum. And those priorities are clear: invest in organizing first, establish data infrastructure second, and support the deals and capital needed to bring them to life third. And I will then pass it on to Olivia, who will tell us how to do this. How do we build those dashboards?
Great. I'm just going to share my screen as I introduce myself. But first, I wanted to start by saying a big thank you to Vidette and Brett and Dylan for their important research. It's not every day that we get research that also offers us a roadmap and a viable solution. So it identifies a huge problem, right? The lack of shared equity housing data, but it doesn't stop there. It tells us what we need to do to get this data and the huge impact that it would have in the field. So I want to first start by thanking them for their important work. And say that this next part of the presentation is going to really be a yes and, because we know we need to do that. We need to follow their roadmap and we need to get that data, but we also know it will take time, right? So the question that I've been tasked to answer in the next couple of minutes is, how can we start using data today to make the case for shared equity housing? So one place we can start is by looking at public data, right? So what public data is currently out there that can demonstrate need, that can communicate your goals, and that can track progress over time? So I'd love to show you a few examples of housing organizations and collectives that I've worked with to build community indicator dashboards that are either entirely or almost entirely made with public data sets. So the first example is partnership with the city of Steamboat Springs in Colorado, which is a mountain town, a ski resort town that's really facing an affordable housing crisis, especially since the rise of remote work and everyone wanting to live where they ski and have a fun time. So we developed this dashboard with them to really first identify what are the North Stars that they're tracking to understand the affordable housing crisis, right? What is it that they're actually trying to move the needle on by creating more affordable housing? So they identified that they've noticed there's been a decline in low and middle income residents, and also a decline in young people that can't afford to stay in the city anymore. So the data that they wanted to track as their North Stars, that is all publicly available, obviously, are these data sets, right, on income and age. So I won't go into all of the charts that we pulled together for them, but I'm just going to scroll through just to make the point that everything on their North Star page and everything on the page on the affordable housing crisis is all public data, right? So first they talk about the North Stars, what they're trying to move the needle on, and then they dive more into public data on what is driving this problem, right? So rising rent, rocketing home prices, rocketing housing cost burden for pretty much everyone except for owners without a mortgage, mounting basic costs for individual earners and for families. So they really make the case through using this public data that's mostly coming from the census. And then as we were building out the dashboard, they started to create their own internal original data set on the affordable housing developments that already exist, that are under construction, that are planned, and that are in discussion. So this is actually, all of this data is live connected to a Google spreadsheet. So as they continue to collect data on existing and potential affordable housing developments, it will reflect live in the dashboard. And I should say also that this dashboard is built with Looker Studio, which is completely free. So this is a really nice lightweight tool to start bringing in public data and also integrating your original data sets. Another data set that they brought in, an original data set, is on policies that will aid the development of affordable housing in Steamboat that they're tracking. And they're tracking the status of these policies. So that's just one example. Another example that uses only public data is this affordable and inclusive housing dashboard that we built with an organization in New York called Erase Racism, whose goal was to really track subsidized housing in the state of New York. And they wanted to understand, is affordable housing being built in high opportunity neighborhoods, which is what this first map is showing, and in places that could lead to more racial integration, which is what the second map is showing. So they can click on a county, they can explore the subsidized housing that exists in this county, and then see how does that track on top of racial segregation and resources and opportunity. And again, all of the data that is in here is all public data. And then the last quick example is a dashboard for Naugatuck Valley project in Connecticut. This is a regional housing umbrella group of many different types of organizations, faith-based organizations, labor unions, a very diverse collective. And they have been working for a very long time on different forms of housing equity in the region. So they wanted a dashboard that tracked their North Star goals around housing equity and these two health equity goals as well. So this first page is showing how Naugatuck Valley is doing across their North Star indicators compared to the state of Connecticut. And also they can choose any region or any town to also make the comparison to. And then what they're working on now is identifying what their goals are over the next 5 years to improve the situation. So this dashboard was just released last month, so they're still working on the goals, but it nicely brings together the data that's important for their work to start tracking their impact. So, and then on the subsequent tabs, you can see the data reflected in a map form at the census tract level. So they get even more granularity than what you would get at the regional level. So this is on housing insecurity, the construction of affordable housing, the location and number of brownfield sites, the percentage of aging housing, and the situation of overcrowded housing units. So going back to, we know that there's a lot of public data that's out there that we can pull on to start working with today. And where do we go to find some of this data? So the two main repositories that we tend to use, especially when it comes to wanting to create maps, is ArcGIS Online's Living Atlas repository that has pretty much most census data in there, CDC data, and HUD data that already exists as map layers. So you can go into these repositories, you can search things like housing insecurity, housing cost burden, and already get map layers that show that either at the census tract level, county level, or state level. So the data is really ready to use. And then on top of that, you can always look to local open data portals. So pretty much like every state has one now. There's a New York or city or even county. So there's a New York City open data. In most places, there's an open data portal. And that has more local data sets. So if you're really interested in looking at education data, public safety, transportation, business, environment, economic development, that would be a good place to go. And the last thing I wanted to show you is how can we start creating a shared data platform using these same tools, right? So we know that we can bring in these public data into these dashboards, but we can also use them to centralize the original data sets that we're creating. And I want to show you just one example of that before we then open it up to discussion. So this is an education example, but I think it's still a nice one because it's easy to understand. So this is showing 48 school districts in the Bronx in District 9. We built this dashboard with the superintendent and other school administrators that wanted to track inequities in school services. So they know that by looking at public data, almost all of the students in their district are high need. But they know there's also, or they had a sense that there is also a big disparity in school services and school resources. So they wanted to create a dashboard that would start tracking that. So what we did for them first is we created the first part of this dashboard using only public data, which you'll see here. We're tracking student need, we're tracking student performance, different types of community demographics, even incidences of different types of crime. And then we worked with them to build out a data portal. So essentially, it's a survey that they give to school administrators. And when they fill out the survey about the school services that they have, it then gets aggregated into the first 4 tabs of this dashboard. So now we're seeing health services, distribution services, adult classes, and after school. So you can see that this is also a way that can bring together, original data sets and public data sets. And this is built on ArcGIS Online dashboards. I'll also mention, because I understand that this is a proprietary tool, so you have to pay for it. But there is a nonprofit license that's about $120 a year. So it's still pretty accessible if this is something that you wanted to start working with. And then lastly, just some takeaways, how to build useful, relevant dashboards. Obviously, it should be community driven. No one understands what data is going to represent their experiences better than community members themselves. So they should always be a part of the conversations of identifying North Star goals and identifying data points that represent community need, right? They should try to demonstrate the need very clearly with the data, set goals, track progress. And if you can, this is really unique to the Steamboat dashboard, not something that I've seen in many other dashboards. It's really nice to identify and track policies, because that really gives people a way to start taking action. So I'll wrap it up there, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Olivia, and thank you to all of our presenters today, to Dylan, to Brett, to Vidette. We really appreciate all that you put on the table in terms of what we have access to, in terms of data, what we still need, how we might approach building a data infrastructure that really works both for decision-making and case-making about shared equity housing, and that really, as Vidette was talking, addresses a wide number of community-driven impacts. Unfortunately, we are just about at the end of the hour, so I don't know that we're going to have time for questions today. However, if you have questions, if you want to dig into this work more, please send them to the Cooperative Development Foundation, to any of us on this call, follow up, and we would be happy to have a separate conversation and connect you with the presenters here. So thank you for your participation. If you would like to delve into this work more, not only are the links in the chat here, but they will be posted on the CDF website, and that link is available to you in the chat. Feel free to share those with others who might be interested. And again, thank you for your work to take this research and start to apply it and find ways to move shared equity housing forward using data. That brings us to the end of our webinar today. Thank you so much for your participation, and we look forward to continuing to partner with you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.